Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. And today's shir is dedicated a Refua Shelema to Chaim Aryeh ben Rivka and Emunah Chaiya bat Shlaima Dvorah. And if I could just insert a personal note, as I mentioned last week, my wife is undergoing some surgical procedures, and I would also like to add her name as a person for whose zechus we should daven. Her name is Sarah Chanah bas Shayna. And all of these should have a Refua Shelema b'toch shar cholei Yisrael. In addition, an Aliyat Neshama for Hasya bas Shlomo, memory of Aryeh Tavinsky's mother. Her Yahrzeit is on the 8th of Shvat. He did have a special request that I say a bracha, shahakol, in memory of his mother. I just want to tell Aryeh that I did do so, but I did so before the shir because I was thirsty, so I did make a bracha with your mother in mind, and Be'ezras Hashem, like all brachos, it should contribute to an Aliyat Neshama. So today, we're still, of course, in the book of Shmos, and in Parshas Bo, which has the last of the three Makos, we actually have Yetzias Mitzrayim itself. The Exodus does occur. And in Parshas Bo already, we have many halachos, many mitzvos. The laws of Korban Pesach, and the laws of Chametz, and the obligation of eating Matzah. And at this point, the Torah becomes very halachic oriented, not just in terms of the narration and the like. And I want to focus on a certain passage that's in the Haggadah that is actually taken from the Mishnah in the 10th parak of Pesachim, and this is the very famous statement of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel haya omer, kol shlo yomar shleisha dvarim halalu b'Pesach. Anybody who does not explain the significance.
My pen to play with?
Oh no, I have. I'm okay. I have two. I have a backup just in case. Anyone that fails to explain three mitzvos of Pesach, connected to the Seder, lo yatsa yedei chovaso, he has not fulfilled his obligation. And the three commandments that have to be explained are Pesach, the eating of the Korban Pesach, Matzah, the eating of Matzah, Maror, the eating of Maror. Now, let's first just analyze the simple translation of the sentence. Anyone that does not explain these three commandments does not or has not fulfilled his obligation. By the way, his or her obligation, because men and women are equal here. What obligation has not been fulfilled by the failure to explain? It is not the obligations of Pesach, Matzah, Maror. I fulfill the mitzvah of bringing the Korban Pesach even if I don't explain it. I fulfill the mitzvah of eating Matzah even if I don't explain it. I fulfill the mitzvah of Maror by eating it, even if I don't explain it. So, lo yatsa yedei chovasai does not mean that the sipor hadvarim is a condition for the mitzvah of Pesach, Matzah, Maror, but rather it is a condition for the mitzvah of Haggadah. There is a mitzvah the night of Pesach to recount the Exodus. And essentially what Rabbi Gamliel is telling me is that the explanation of Pesach, Matzah, Maror is a condition to a fulfillment of the mitzvah of the narration of the Exodus. Now this is not intuitively obvious. One might have thought, if I give you the history, I talk about the plagues, I talk about Paro's heart being hardened, and I talk about the Jews leaving Mitzrayim, who says I have to talk about the Pesach, Matzah, Maror? That's, in a sense, a consequence of the history, rather than part of the historical account itself. And yet, indeed, Pesach, the explanation of Pesach, Matzah, Maror, is a chelek of the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. In fact, it is arguable, although I'm not sure I have a definite proof for this, that because it is situated as a component of the Haggadah, then even if a person didn't have matzah, let's say in a concentration camp, didn't have Maror, and of course today, without a Beis HaMikdash, we don't have Korban Pesach. But we still have to recount this because it's not because of the mitzvah of Pesach Matzah Maror, rather it is because of the Haggadah itself. Right? This is very important. Now because of this, let me just point out a halachic observation that people need to pay attention to. The paragraphs that explain Pesach Matzah Maror is towards the end of the Maggid. It is before the second cup. People are hungry, you've been going for a while, depending how long you conduct your Seder, and whoever is bringing out the food, usually the women, but men can bring out the food as well, people will often get up around the Rabban Gamliel paragraphs and go into the kitchen. But the truth of the matter is, that is the single most important part of the Haggadah. That is the one part of the Haggadah that cannot be skipped. You can skip the 4 sons, which everybody loves, but that actually is an option. I mean, it's a minhag, obviously, whatever the minhag we say, but halachically, you are yotzei the mitzvah of Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim, even if you didn't discuss the 4 sons. But you're not yotzei the mitzvah de'oraisa of Sipri Yitzias Mitzrayim if you don't explain the significance of Pesach Matzah Maror. So what that means is, if anybody is going to get up and go into the kitchen while those paragraphs are being recited, they must either recite them ahead of time or recite them when they come back before they drink the second cup. Before they drink the second cup, because it is an indispensable chelek of the Haggadah of the Maggid, which must be recited over the second cup of wine, albeit that's a rabbinic requirement, as we talked about last week, but you have to say it before you drink the second cup, because that chelek of the Haggadah has to be said over the wine. Now, I want to connect tonight Rabbi Gamliel's statements that anyone that doesn't explain Pesach Matzah Maror is not yotzei his mitzvah with another statement in the Haggadah, that chayav adam liros es atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. Right? This is again a passage. Every person must regard themselves as if they themselves were personally liberated from Mitzrayim. And the Haggadah says, Lo es avoseinu bilvad, it is not only our forefathers that Hashem redeemed, but Hashem redeemed us. Now, compare this to an earlier statement at the beginning of the Haggadah, which is slightly different. In the beginning of the Haggadah, we said, if Hashem would not have taken our forefathers out of Egypt, we and our children and our children's children might still have been enslaved or assimilated or disappeared, however you interpret it. Now that's not the same thing as what the Haggadah says at the end. In the beginning, we're not saying I was liberated. What we're saying is, I am grateful for what happened to my ancestors, because had my ancestors not been liberated, I might not be here. But that's not saying I have to regard it as if I myself was taken out of Mitzrayim. That simply says, I makir tov for what happened to my ancestors, because that benefits me. But by the end of the Maggid, we're making a much more radical claim. It is not simply, I'm grateful for the liberation of my ancestors because I benefit from that spiritually as well as physically, but we make the claim that I myself was liberated from Mitzrayim. How can that be so? That's not true. I was never in Egypt. I certainly was not a slave in Egypt. How can it be said? I am chayav to regard myself as if I myself was liberated from Egypt. So there are 2 explanations. One explanation I actually talked about last week, but I'm going to bring it in again. But the simple explanation, which the Rambam himself gives, is that the chayav adam liros es atzmai is a form of method acting. Those of you who might remember from a prior existence, Marlon Brando, method acting and the like, understand the notion of putting yourself in the role, the power of imagination, right? So the method actor Lee Strasberg, would go into hiding, for a week to get themselves in the mood. In fact, I've even heard that some actors who were supposed to play evil people, they got so into the role that they committed suicide, that they contact with the powers of evil, in the context of preparing for the role, like literally destroyed them. That's how serious they took the role. And the truth of the matter is, Rav Chaskel Levenstein, Zichrono Livracha, one of the great Balei Musar of the 20th century, once said, a Baal Musar has to have a good imagination. A Baal Musar should visualize Yitzias Mitzrayim, should visualize Matan Torah, should visualize Kriyas Yamsuf. So the Rambam says, obviously he doesn't use the term method acting, that when it says I have to regard myself as if I was liberated from Egypt, it's not that it actually happened. It didn't happen to me. But in order for me to appreciate what Hashem has done, I have to imagine what it's like to be a slave. I have to feel the pain of the whip. I have to feel the humiliation. I have to feel the suffering. And then I imagine myself what type of joy I would have when the great day comes, that I'm finally free. So according to the Rambam, the Chayav Adam Lirais Es Atzmai Kilu Yatzim Mitzrayim is a form of harnessing the power of imagination to relive or to experience something that you actually never did experience, because that way your heart is filled with joy and appreciation. In other words, I don't mean this pejoratively at all, it is a make-believe exercise in order to generate Hakarat HaTov. Right? That is what the Rambam says. Now, Al Pi Kabbalah, which I'm not going to get into, there is this notion that all of the future souls of the Jewish people were in fact enslaved in Mitzrayim. And therefore, even if I don't remember it, and even if my body, so to speak, was not in Mitzrayim, my neshama was there. So in a quite literal sense, there was a liberation because there was an enslavement. Right? That's the Kabbalistic idea that the Aryeh talks about the imprisonment of all of the neshamas, the totality of Am Yisrael, past, present, and future. So that's a second mahalach. But the third mahalach is the one that I actually shared a week or two ago, maybe last week or 2 weeks ago, and that is from the Baal HaTanya. And you'll remember that the Baal HaTanya tells us that the word Mitzrayim has a double meaning. Mitzrayim, of course, means Egypt, but Mitzrayim also means limitation, boundary, constriction, blockage. And every person has a Mitzrayim in their life. The Mitzrayim could be egotism, could be gaiva, could be hedonism, it could be self-loathing, it could be laziness. Whatever it would be, lack of enthusiasm or passion in life. There are blockages that stop us from connecting to God. And when God liberated the Jewish people from Mitzrayim, i.e. Egypt, he put into the Bria, into the creation, a power that enables us to be liberated from the Mitzrayims that exist within our own lives. So says the Baal HaTanya very beautifully, each person must regard themselves as if they were taken out of Mitzrayim, does not mean each person has to regard themselves as if they were a slave under Paro in Egypt that God took out. That didn't happen, at least non-Kabbalistically. But rather, each person must identify their Mitzrayim and understand that the koach of Yetzias Mitzrayim will give each and every one of us a liberation and a freedom. So if you had to pick, I don't know if you remember in middle school or the like, they used to call it junior high. So when you would read a paragraph, you'd have to pick the topic sentence of the paragraph. Like, what is the yesod? What is the foundational idea of the paragraph? It's not always the first sentence. Often it is, but sometimes it's in the middle. So if you had to pick the topic sentence of the Haggadah, it would be Chayav Adam Liros, under any interpretation, Chayav Adam Liros Es Atzmo Ki'ilu Hu Yatsa Mitzrayim. Which means, in other words, the Haggadah is not about memory or commemoration. It is about experiencing a process of liberation from whatever Mitzrayim enslaves me. Every person has a Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is a reality in our life. David HaMelech called out in agony, Min ha-Meitzar karatzika, I call out to Hashem from the Meitzar Mitzrayim, from the narrow, confining places. Anani b'merchav, that Hashem should answer me with expansiveness, openness, free me, liberate me, so I can become what the potential of my neshama is intended to become. Right? That's the yesod of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So seen in this way, as you go through the narrative of Yetzias Mitzrayim, both in terms of the Haggadah itself and in terms of the Chumash, the story, there is a double meaning, there is a double dialogue that's going on. There is, of course, the events that happened, the plagues and everything else, but then there's another, and that's a Dvorah Shavah L'chol Nefesh, meaning that is the collective story of the Jewish people, meaning that is our story, that is the shared experience. But there's also an idiosyncratic, unique meaning that applies to each individual person as they struggle with their own Mitzrayim. And that is not necessarily a shared thing. Everybody has their own Mitzrayim. Everybody has their own struggle. Everybody has their own process. Right? So I wouldn't necessarily call it lower meaning and higher meaning, but there is what you might call general meaning, which of course is very, very important. That is the shared history of the Jewish people, how we became the nation of God. But then there is the idiosyncratic, private meaning that applies to me in Mitzrayim, in my Mitzrayim. So seen in this way, therefore, the mitzvos of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror can be understood both in terms of a general commemoration of the Exodus, but also in terms of the specific application to my own struggles and my own Mitzrayim. So I'm going to take it in reverse order, and I'll explain at the end why I'm going in reverse order. Instead of looking at Pesach, Matzah, Maror, I'm going to start with Maror. Right? There is a mitzvah that the night of Pesach we have to eat some bitter herbs. Maror, we make a bracha. Asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al achilas maror. Maror, in a way, is a kind of simple. It's to commemorate the slavery of Egypt, to remember the bitterness, remember the slavery. How does that apply to my own Mitzrayim? So perhaps the lesson is that the very first step towards achieving a liberation from your Mitzrayim is to be honest in recognizing that you are a slave. Not to live in a state of denial. Far too often, things in life are not going right. My relationships with other human beings, spouse, children, other people, not good. My relationship with Hashem is not what it should be. There are issues that a person fails to acknowledge. You sweep it under the carpet, and if you sweep enough under the carpet, the pile gets so high it goes up to the ceiling. So Maror says the first step towards being liberated from my inner Mitzrayim is to be honest and open. I don't mean to other people, to yourself. Honest and open to myself that I have the bitterness of slavery that I have to deal with. Because by openly acknowledging, when I say openly I mean to yourself, by honestly acknowledging, I should say, that I am a slave, that there may be aspects of my life that are out of control. There may be inyanim that are not mesudar, that are not going in the right direction. That is the very first step. And I remember years ago, I used to live in Silver Spring, Maryland. So I taught at the University of Maryland Law School, which was in Baltimore. So if you go from Silver Spring to Baltimore, you drive north, 95 north. Right? Just take a highway, major highway, 95 north. So I was doing that. But I remember that there were times I would be driving, and one time I remember in particular, and I wasn't paying attention, and there's like a turnoff to 95 South, and all of a sudden I'm driving and I notice the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. Now, if you know that area, you don't really see that when you're going north on Baltimore. You only see that when it's 95 south going to Virginia. Now, I went through a mental process. I can't even explain how this is even sensible. I didn't want to admit to myself that somehow I got on the wrong side, because I really didn't know how to get back. And, so I was actually telling myself, maybe you never noticed this going to Baltimore. Maybe you do see it on the way to Baltimore. You just never noticed, so you're seeing something new. I didn't want to admit I was lost, because I didn't know how to get out of being lost. So I figured I would just keep driving, and what happened? Well, the truth is, 95 South does go all the way to Key West, Florida. And at that point, you make a U-turn and you're back to 95 North, but I would have been late for class. It just, it wouldn't have worked that well. So, and of course this happens all the time in life. People invest money. This is the famous idea of throwing bad money, after good money. You invest money in some failure, and you keep on putting more and more and more and more in because you hope that somehow you'll turn it around, as opposed to cutting your losses. And we have the famous statement of Albert Einstein that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and over again and expect a different result. Doesn't happen that much. So the first step to getting back in the right direction, 95 North, is to admit that I'm on the wrong road. Until I admitted I was on the wrong road, I had no chance of getting on the right road. So that's Maror. Maror is the courage to admit that there are things in our lives that need to be corrected. And inertia can take you only so far, but at some point, we got to deal with things. That's what Maror says. Now, we then come to Matzah. Now, I want to digress a little bit and talk about Matzah, because the truth is, Matzah is actually a very complicated idea. In fact, the very story of Matzah. Why do we eat Matzah? So we say, let me just tell you what the problem is. There's actually a major interpretive pshat problem in how to understand the idea of Matzah. It says that the morning of the Exodus, the 15th of Nisan, we were baking bread for the trip. And what happened was the Egyptians were so anxious to get us out of there. And according to Kabbalah, Hashem was so anxious to get us out of there because we would have hit the 50th level of Tumah, right? The Chumash doesn't say that directly. The Chumash says the Egyptians were pushing us out. The Arizal adds the dimension that had we waited even a few minutes, we would have hit level 50 and that would have been it. But whatever it is, the idea was, because we had to get out of there in a hurry, either because of the Egyptians or because of Hashem, we didn't have time to let our dough rise, so we had to bake it in a state of matzah, and therefore Hashem commanded that we eat matzah to commemorate the chipazon, the hurriedness through which we left Mitzrayim. And that's what the Chumash says. Now, there's a real problem with this. The implication is, had Paro said, take your time, whenever you're ready to go, or had Hashem said, yeah, take your time, the narrative implies we would have made chametz. We would have made chametz. We weren't able to make chametz because we were kicked out, either by God or by Mitzrayim, right? But here's the problem. 2 weeks before the Exodus, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, God gave us a bunch of commandments. And among those commandments were, before the Exodus, you must eat matzah and you're not allowed to have chametz for 7 days. So by the time we're baking our bread, the morning of the 15th, we don't have a choice to make it chametz. We're already commanded it has to be matzah. So how can you say, right, we're going in circles, how can you say the reason I eat matzah is because I was kicked out so fast from Mitzrayim? Either by Hashem or Mitzrayim, that's not relevant to this question. Right? The reason I eat matzah is because I was kicked out so quickly that I didn't have time to let my dough rise. Even if I had time, I couldn't have let my dough rise because Hashem already told me you're not allowed to have chametz. This was 2 weeks before. You see, it's really a fundamental, difficult question. So, here is what the Ran says. The Ran offers a very interesting explanation based on the Mishnah in Psachim that says, and again, the proofs are a bit intricate, so I won't be able to go into all of the proofs, but I'll give you the conclusions. That halachically there was a difference between the Pesach as it was celebrated in Mitzrayim, the very first Pesach, and the Pesach that would be celebrated in later years, both in the desert and in Eretz Yisrael. And that is, Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isser of eating chametz was only the first day. It did not apply to all 7 days. It's only L'Dorot that there's an Isser of 7 days. And the second distinction is that even on that one day, the Isser is only eating the chametz. There is no Isser to possess the chametz or own it. In other words, Pesach Mitzrayim differed from Pesach Doros. Pesach Doros means all future Pesachs in 2 ways. Number one, Pesach Doros, the Isser of Chametz, is 7 days. Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isser of Chametz is only 1 day. Difference one. Difference number two, Pesach Doros, not only is there a prohibition against eating chametz, but there's a prohibition against owning chametz, right? That's why we sell our chametz or destroy our chametz. This is called Bal Yera'eh, Bal Yimatzeh. You should not see chametz that belongs to you, or it should not be found in your possession. Masha'en Kein in Pesach Mitzrayim, there was no Isser of Bal Yera'eh, Bal Yimatzeh, of owning chametz. So says the Ran, therefore, the following. The morning of the 15th, they were not allowed to eat bread. That's true. But since they were baking not just for immediate consumption, they were baking for the trip, they would have been permitted to make bread, chametz stick of bread, which they could carry with him on day one in order to eat it on day two. So, but what happened was, to commemorate the idea that we were kicked out so quickly that we were not able to make it rise, Hashem then said, Mikanu lahaba, starting from the next year, you're not allowed to eat this chametz or even own this chametz for the 7 days. In other words, this way everything gets fit. The commandment they were given, Rosh Chodesh, only prohibited them from eating bread day one, and they were allowed to own it. And therefore, the morning of the 15th, they could make chametz to carry for future journeys. But since, as a zecher l'chipazon, to commemorate the hurriedness by which we were expelled, we weren't able to let the dough rise, that's why it became a 7-day memorial. This is how the Ran reconciles it. Which means the following. The first Seder, which was the night before this event, they did eat matzah. What was the reason of the matzah? I mean, here's the problem. I mean, you're telling me we eat matzah at the Seder to commemorate the haste in which we were forced to leave Egypt. But that haste didn't occur till the next morning. So what was the point of eating matzah the night before? Right? A child would ask his father, why am I eating matzah now? And the father would say, well, God commanded us 2 weeks ago that we have to eat matzah tonight, which is true. But then the kid says, but why? Dad could not answer, because of the haste with which we left Mitzrayim, because we didn't leave Mitzrayim yet. So the answer is that the meaning of matzah at the first Seder, the very first Seder, is not the same as the meaning of matzah from every other Seder since then. Matzah, in fact, has a double symbolism. Matzah is a zecher, is a commemoration of chipazon, the hurriedness by which we had to leave Egypt, otherwise we would have hit the 50th level. And it shows how God saves us in the nick of time. But matzah is also a slavery symbol, because it is called the bread of affliction. As the Ibn Ezra writes, Paro used to feed slaves matzah, because matzah sticks in your belly and it takes a long time to digest. So when I eat matzah, I'm doing two things at once. I'm commemorating the redemption of God, b'chipazon, but I'm also, like Maror, reenacting the slavery. Which would mean, in other words, the very first Seder, matzah was just to remind us of the slavery. Now you may say, why do you have to be reminded? You're a slave. But the short answer is, God is kind of telling you, just like eating Maror, that even though I'm liberating you, never forget where you're coming from. In other words, the point I'm making is, matzah acquired a new symbolism from year 2 onwards that it did not actually have in year 1. It's an interesting idea that matzah is a complex symbol in that way. Right? Maror is a slavery symbol. 4 cups of wine, which is rabbinic, is a freedom symbol. Matzah is a composite symbol of both the bread of affliction and the chipazon, the hurriedness of God's redemption. So matzah has a lot of different meanings, but one meaning of matzah, Maral says, well, first of all, many Svarim talk about the idea that chametz and matzah represent the polarities of arrogance versus humility. Chametz is puffed up, filled with itself. It represents gaiva. Matzah, all the air is taken out, represents humbleness, humility, submission. That's one message, of course. That's why chametz represents the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is called Sa'or Shebe'isa, the leavening agent in the dough, because the Yetzer Hara operates primarily through gaiva and arrogance. Right, so that's one idea. There's another idea, the Maral points out, that chametz is capable of spoilage. Chametz rots. Right? Bread gets moldy. Matzah does not spoil. And again, that signifies the idea that when you connect to that evil, the Yetzer Hara, ultimately you're entering a state of rottedness. As opposed to matzah, you can have matzah from Masada, right? It still is going to be edible and the like. But the Maral gives a third idea of chametz and matzah. And he says, chametz represents inertia. Because you don't have to do anything to make chametz. Again, this is very important. You don't need yeast. You don't need a starter. No, a professional baker would have all of these things. But according to halacha, if water hits flour and you do nothing for 18 minutes, 18 or to 22 minutes, machlokes, whatever degree of fermentation takes place is halachically chametz. You don't have to do anything. Chametz is what happens by itself, and matzah requires the affirmative action of arresting the process of chametz before the 18 minutes by baking it, in which the heat destroys the enzymes that would cause the fermentation. So says the Maral, chametz represents inertia. Matzah represents taking action. Right? That's why, in fact, Chazal commonly describe whenever you delay an opportunity, it says, Al tachmitz, do not make the opportunity chametz. Don't wait too long. Mitzvah haba liyadcha, when a mitzvah comes to your hand, Al tachmitzena, don't let it become chametz. Chametz is inertia. Okay, so we have 3 associations. Chametz is arrogance. Chametz is spoilage, rat. Chametz is inertia. Matzah is action. In fact, I believe the Shalach Kadesh says, you even see this in the letters. Chametz and matzah share two common letters, Mem and Tzaddik. Chametz has Ches and matzah has Hey. So if you can visualize it, a Hey is simply a Ches that's truncated, meaning imagine the left leg. So if it's growing, let's say it's growing towards the top. So if you let it reach the top, you have a Ches. If you cut it short, you have a Hey, which means matzah is that which could have become chametz and did not. It represents taking decisive action. In fact, based on this, there's a very interesting halacha that may sound a little paradoxical. And that is, we know that the only grains that can become chametz are the 5 grains. That's wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. They can become chametz if they're mixed with water. Rice, millet, buckwheat, quinoa cannot become chametz. Now the fact that Ashkenazim don't eat rice, called kitnios, or don't eat corn, those are minhagim that became binding at some point. But though rice, it's a davar pashut, rice cannot become chametz. Right? Because, in fact, there are even scientific reasons. The particular processes of fermentation is limited to those 5 species. So that's a well-known idea, that only the chameshes minei dagan can become chametz. But here is the thing that's a little counterintuitive. The only things that you can use for matzah are the things that are capable of becoming chametz. So I can make matzah from wheat, which of course is the most matzah. I can make it from barley, I can make it from oats. People who have celiac or gluten intolerance can often have oat matzah. You can have rye matzah, although I've never seen it. Spelt matzah. But you can't have corn matzah, even if you're Sephardi, you can't have rice matzah. The only thing that can be kosher for matzah are things that potentially can become chametz. Now, you might have thought, maybe we ought to go the opposite way. If the whole point is, I want to be really, really sure I don't have chametz, then maybe I would have said, make my matzah from something that's not chametz, that cannot be chametz. The answer is no, because you see, if matzah is a lesson in combating inertia by taking initiative, it has to be something that if you don't take the initiative, it's going to turn into the bad thing. If it's not going to turn into the bad thing, no matter how much time you waste, then matzah is no longer symbolic of seizing the moment. That's why, by the way, among briskers, for example, they actually keep their consumption of matzah down to the minimum. Because if you think about it, the most dangerous food to eat on Pesach is matzah. Because matzah is the thing. Well, of course, if it's baked, it's okay. But, potentially, what is the most potential chametzdika item you might have in your house? It might be the matzah if it wasn't properly watched, if it wasn't properly supervised. In fact, the halacha is, if the matzah is inflated, puffed up a little bit, you got to discard it right before Pesach. You check your matzahs for any type. If it's folded over, there's a fear that part of it in the fold was not baked properly. And that's why gebraks, right, the minhagim of Hasidim, the sharuya, that they will not eat matzah that's dipped in liquid or soup, is because of the fear that maybe part of the matzah is unbaked, and if you expose it to liquid, it might become chametz. Right? I remember reading, there's a fascinating book, I'll give a little plug for it. It's called John Lennon and the Jews. I don't know if some of you might have come across it. It's a very hilariously funny book. The author is a professor at Bar Ilan. I'm not sure if he's totally orthodox. He seems very traditional, very knowledgeable. I'm not sure if he's 100% from or not, but it is a very, very fascinating book. In fact, it's a very interesting book. His whole thesis is really a an argument with John Lennon's song Imagine, right? John Lennon has a song Imagine where he talks about how much the world would be better if we wouldn't have different religions and different nations and different ethnicities. We would all just live in achdus and unity, and why have this religion and that religion? Imagine. So this book is trying to show that unless you have particular connections to family, to God, you're not able to be universally kind to everybody. Universal kindness comes from the strength of particular attachments. Quite a brilliant book. But he tells a story, in the middle, there's all sorts of stories there, that he's invited to Pesach to some very religious friends. And he said every year he looks forward to matzah balls at the Seder. This is like his dream, matzah ball. And he's invited, and this is a gourmet cook, and he's so excited. And there's a long Haggadah, and they're going through this and that and that and that. And finally the moment arrives where the soup is being brought to the table. And he sees his soup is clear, just clear soup. So he coughs and he says, they forgot to put in the matzah ball, So they said, well, we don't eat matzah balls on Pesach, Shabuya. And he didn't know. So then, he figured he didn't know what that was. So he just took his own piece of matzah. He figured he would dunk it into the soup. So he dunks it. So then he says, it was like those movies where the person is in slow motion, he's shouting. He says, the woman jumped over the table, took his soup bowl, threw it out of it was like the fifth story, threw it out of the house. Luckily nobody was walking by at the time. And the guy didn't know what was going on. But she said, you can't do this. Treif, we don't do this on Pesach. We don't have matzah on Pesach. We eat the matzah that we have to have. We don't do it. Then he went to another place where they served matzah, but the matzah was in a plastic garbage thing, so it shouldn't give any crumbs on the table, etc. And he said, I thought Pesach is about matzah, So they told him, you can eat matzah the rest of the year. On Pesach, we don't eat matzah. Because of this idea that matzah is the closest thing to chametz. Okay, so now let's apply this to the paradigm. Right, I had mentioned Maror, that the first step of Maror is to be liberated from your own Mitzrayim. You have to acknowledge your slavery. If you don't acknowledge your slavery, there's no way you can be free. But acknowledgement of a problem is not enough. Matzah symbolizes the imperative of action. It's not enough to be aware of my deficit. I got to take concrete action to address it. There are people who go into therapy their entire life, right? Psychotherapy. So they know every little problem they've had from the time they were born, and maybe even pre-birth trauma, maybe preconception trauma, who knows what's going on up there in Shemayim, and they know everything. But they never take constructive movement to address it, to change it. And if Maror is the cognitive awareness that I have issues, Matzah is taking the opportunity in a concrete way to address it. Take decisive action. There was an American academic, Robert Hutchins, not Jewish, who was a very, very brilliant person. This is going back to the 40s and 50s. He was president of the University of Chicago at the age of 25, which is quite amazing. A lot of the graduate students were older than he when he was a college president. He was a true prodigy. And at one point, somebody was concerned that he was not getting enough physical exercise. And they said to him, Dr. Hutchins says, don't you ever feel the urge to exercise? So he said, I surely do. But whenever I have the urge, I lie down and I just know if I wait a few minutes, it'll pass. I wait till it passes. I don't let it bother me. That's undoubtedly true with exercise. And it's also true with spiritual growth. All of us have moments of inspiration. There are times that we get up, we really want to do something. Maybe it's after Yom Kippur. Maybe it's at a Pesach Seder. It might be a family simcha. You have a child getting married and you just feel you want to express gratitude in some ways. Sometimes it might just be the awareness that we're zocheh to be in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, a place where Moshe Rabbeinu was not zocheh to go. And there are moments which a person does have a genuine desire to be changed in a positive way. Actually, and I actually don't mean change, but to kind of access what's already there. That's actually the meaning of tshuva. Tshuva is not changing. It's returning to what you are. But the thing is, with inspiration, unless you concretize it in tangible action, inspiration just leaves after a while. When you kind of concretize it, then it gets stronger. It's like a bridge, the way you build a suspension bridge. It starts off with like a cord, a single cord, going across a wire, going across a span of water, whatever it will be. And that wire can hold, another wire, and eventually you build on that till it can hold tons and tons and tons of weight. That's the nature of a mitzvah. This is what Chazal say when they say, mitzvah geireres mitzvah. A mitzvah causes a mitzvah. So you concretize your inspiration in tangible action, even if it's very small. And then it grows on you and it grows in you, it grows within you to bring you to higher and higher places. So Maror is to be aware of my problem. Matzah is to have the courage to take a step to actually deal with it. Don't just stay in the psychoanalytic therapeutic mode for 50 years. Become a behaviorist, so to speak, in which you actually try to change things in behavior. Now, there's actually a beautiful story from Rav Nachman of Breslov. Rav Nachman, as everyone knows, Rav Nachman taught in many, many different modalities, but one of his famous modalities were stories. Not the only one. People think Rav Nachman is only a storyteller. That's obviously not the case. Likutei Moharan is filled with very, very deep Kabbalistic Torah. But he did teach by story, and he once said a very practical thing. He says, there's a certain milah when you teach by a story. If I teach by Divrei Torah, so if you get it, you get it. If you don't get it, you got nothing. I teach by story, so if you get the deep message, you get it. And if you don't, you got a good story. So teaching by stories is always good, because either way, somebody benefits from it. So in one of his stories, he talks about a prince who was convinced that he was a chicken. He didn't think he was human anymore. He took off all of his clothes. He was crawling around under the table, and he was eating table scraps. And people tried to talk him out of this, and there was no way that they could convince him. He just didn't listen to anybody. So finally, a wise man shows up and says, I will cure this person. And the thing he does is he takes off his clothes, and he crawls under the table, and he eats scraps along with the prince. So the prince looks at him. For some reason, the prince could still talk. I'm not sure how that worked, talking chicken. And he says, what are you doing? So the man said, I'm a chicken too, just like you. So they're clucking together, and they're eating off the table. Then after a while, the guy puts on a pair of pants, and the prince says, what are you doing? He says, who says chickens can't wear pants? Okay, so the prince puts on pants. Then he puts on a shirt. Says, who says chickens can't wear shirts? Then he stands up and says, who says chickens can't stand up? Sits at the table. So the long and the short of it was that after 6 months, the prince still thought he was a chicken. He still thought he was a chicken. But it made no difference, because he internalized the idea that a chicken could do absolutely everything that a human being could do. So l'may nafka mina. Now, would we say that the prince was cured? Well, I suppose in a literal way he wasn't cured. He was still laboring under a delusion. But what difference does it make? He was acting like a human being. Now, Rav Nachman never tells you the point of his stories. I mean, these are stories, and to this very day, People discuss it, they debate it, there are commentaries on the stories and commentaries on the commentaries, and people are mechadesh. But I think that there's a relatively simple message here, and that is, don't let your mental self-image prevent you from becoming the person you're capable of becoming from. We often have a certain image. I'm a turkey, so to speak, to switch from chicken to turkey, meaning I'm not capable. I can't be the one that, learns Daf Yomi, or I can't be the one that goes to Minyan every day, or I can't be the one that greets people who are strangers in shul with a smiling face and a shalom aleichem. That isn't me. I have a certain image, and my image does not allow me to behave that certain way. So there are two ways of addressing it. The harder way is to directly attack that image, which you might have gotten from childhood, and work on it and obliterate it and change it. Another way of saying, okay, I have that image, but that's not going to stop me. A chicken can do this too. What happens is, the longer you behave as a human being, then the less likely you'll think you're a chicken. Meaning to say, instead of saying, I got to change my mental attitude, and that will change my actions, let the actions change the attitude instead of the attitude changing the actions. I think that's Rav Nachman's point, to not allow yourself to be paralyzed by a negative self-image, to kind of just jump in, just like Nachshon ben Aminadav in next week's Parsha jumps into the Yam Suf, jumps into the raging sea. So again, Maror is to be honestly aware of your slavery. Matzah is take action. We then come to Korban Pesach. Again, I'll explain why I reversed the order when I finish. Now, Korban Pesach has many, many, many symbols. There, it's again, many, many ways of looking at the Korban Pesach. But there's one interesting halacha of Korban Pesach, which is a machlokus in the Gemara, but we paskin this way, and that is, Ein shochten es ha-Pesach al hayachid. You cannot bring a Korban Pesach as an isolated individual. Meaning, even if you don't have any family, you have to join up with another group. Even if you have a small little lamb that's only 1 month old, and you have a voracious appetite, and you can finish the whole thing yourself, halachically, you are mechuyev to join up with other people. You cannot bring the Korban Pesach as a yachid. Again, it's a machlokas in the Gemara, but this is how the Rambam paskins. And the lesson here is that in trying to get out of my own Mitzrayim, I should not take the journey by myself. I need to be connected to other people who share my values, share my dreams, share my hopes, in which each of us gives chizuk and strength and inspiration to the other. Ideally, that could be the husband and wife situation, but it also applies in other relationships. It applies to the shul I belong to, my yeshiva, my kollel, my chaverim, my chavrusas. You have to seek out in life people who share your aspirations to grow in that direction. Shlomo HaMelech says in Koheles, the wisest of all people, Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad. Two are better than one. For when you have two people and one falls, ha'echad yakim et chaveiro. The other person can raise him up. If you're all by yourself and you fall, who's going to raise you? Now, this is literally true in the case of ice, right? If you're walking on ice and you fall, it's very hard to get up on ice without somebody picking you up. But it also refers to life. In life, all of us go through challenges, times of despondency, times where we don't have hope, times where things just seem too hard. But when you're connected, again, the spouse might be the optimal, but again, this can apply outside of marriage too. When I have a chaver, when I have a friend, they will give me chizuk when life is hard for me. But let me point out, you have to be ready to give chizuk when life is hard for them. That's actually an important point. Pirkei Avos talks about friendship, kinei l'cha chaver, which literally means buy a friend. What do you mean buy a friend? What, I pay money for it? So some say it's, you pay for a 50-minute hour, so your therapist is your friend for 50 minutes. Once the 50 minutes are up, he's not your friend anymore, but for 50 minutes you have a friend. But the simple meaning is, you buy a friend by being a friend. The purchase price of friendship is giving friendship. See, far too often, people want someone to be there for them because they have problems, but they're not willing to be there for the other person. There has to be a reciprocity here. I have my weakness. I need you to help me, but you'll have your weakness, and I'll be there to try to help you. Right? So that's the idea of Pesach. That everybody has their own Mitzrayim, everybody has their struggles, everybody has their weaknesses, everybody has their challenges. But you try to deal with it in the context of community. The Rambam writes, although he may have gotten this from Aristotle, but I'll say it in the name of the Rambam. The Rambam writes, there are 3 types of friendships that exist in the world. The lowest type of friendship is a practical friendship, meaning to say, I need friends because there'll be times in my life that I need something. So for example, if I lose my car keys, or I lose the keys to my house, if I don't have a friend, like, who do I call? So friends, on that utilitarian basis, is like an insurance policy, a life insurance policy. You hope you're not going to need it, or whatever, but it's good to have when you need it. So that's what we'll call utilitarian friendship. I have people that I can call when I don't have my keys, when there's a fire, when I have to go to the hospital. Kind of life insurance policy friends. Then there's another type of friendship, which might be called social. Man is a social animal. We get lonely. We want people that we can interact to for social benefit of one side or the other. Introverts may need it less, extroverts may need it more, but everybody needs some level of contact with other human beings. All of these are legitimate. Utilitarian friendships, social friendships have a makam. But the Rambam says the highest and deepest type of friendship is what we would call a spiritual friendship, in which each one is trying to help the other become the best person they can become. Now that type of friendship may not always be an easy friendship. You see, if I'm a friend with somebody casually because, we schmooze together sometimes, or, we help each other out, I don't need to confront. If I see that they're doing something that's not so great, or they see that I'm doing something that's not so great, I don't have to talk about it. Meaning, okay, we'll just not bother. But when you have the deepest level of spiritual friendship, then each one wants to help the other person become the better person they become. That sometimes means you got to bring up uncomfortable issues. And that sometimes means you have to be willing to hear something uncomfortable about you, about us. But that is the friendship that's transformative. That is the friendship that Shlomo HaMelech is talking about. Ho'echad yakim et chaveiro. I'm there to pick you up, you're there to pick me up. And together we can achieve things that we wouldn't have been able to achieve alone. So, what we've done is taken Rabbi Gamliel's statement in reverse order, and I will end with why I reversed the order. There is a reason for that. We started with Maror, Matzah, Pesach. Maror, acknowledge your slavery. Matzah, do something about it. Pesach, and find a community. It doesn't have to be a large community. It can be one other person, but find other people with which you can move forward and give chizuk to each other. So now, the last question is the order. First of all, look at the Seder itself. First we eat matzah, and then we eat maror, then we combine it, okay? Now, if Maror is awareness of my problem, and matzah is doing something about it, then why do you eat matzah before Maror? I mean, l'chayra, I can't do something about a problem till I have identified my slavery. So we ought to eat Maror before matzah. Why do we eat matzah before Maror? And the answer would be this. It's true that you cannot address a slavery, you cannot address a problem until you've identified the problem. But you have to internalize within yourself that you have the power to address the problem before you confront your negativity. Because there's always a danger. If I jump into identifying my deficits, I will be depressed, I will be despairing, I will be hopeless. So I can't start with the Maror. I have to start with my capacity for constructive change. Then I can move to looking at my negativities, and then I combine them, the korech. I combine awareness of my negativities with constructive change of matzah. I eat them together, and I'm able to do it. So, ein achinami, Maror is the first step you have to go through before you have a matzah strategy. But you need to internalize the lesson of matzah first, because that will give you the strength and the confidence and the emunah to be able to address the particular slavery that you are in. Once again, the context of community is going to be very, very important in this. You know, it is a truism, really, that Rav Soloveitchik writes about this very eloquently, that you can be in a crowded room of hundreds and hundreds of people, and you can feel very, very lonely and isolated, alone, not connected. Now, you don't have to be connected to hundreds of people. You actually don't need that. But all of us, it is a human need, it's a religious need, it's a Jewish need, it's a neshama need. We need to have some people, even one other person, to which we can connect. Because otherwise, we're not able to go on our journey, and that's tova mashnaya min echad. So, b'ezras Hashem, I hope all of us, in one way or the other, should find those connections. And as I mentioned last week, in the name of the Shalah, in these Parshias of Shevavim, we are getting a nitzutz, we are getting a spark of the koach of Yetzias Mitzrayim, although that koach comes out in its strongest Pesach time. But in these Parshias, B'Zeir Anpin, in microcosm, we're experiencing the awesome koach of Yetzias Mitzrayim that can liberate us from all of the things that enslave us. So thank you, and have a Shvua Tov.
Shama